right. Wow. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Welcome to everybody from the morning time, the afternoon time, and the evening time. People are zooming in from all over the world, which is very exciting to see. Um, Welcome to the second lecture in Kosmos Institute's online talk series. We created these talks as a prelude to our first annual colloquium, which takes place in Ascona this December. The talks are meant to open our field of inquiry beyond those limited few folks who are going to be gathering with us in Switzerland. They allow us to begin thinking together publicly and generously about the deeper questions that will shape the colloquium itself: consciousness, psyche, spirit, nature, symbolic imagination, and the emerging image of the self-actualized human being in our time. As someone not born and bred in the West, I sometimes feel I have access to a point of view that may elude those who are through and through Westerners, so to speak. For the past few months, I've been sitting with a provocative question. If so many of the calamities now befalling the world can be traced in large part to the somewhat heavy-handed influence of Western thought and its associated value systems, why would anyone in their right mind turn to Western thinkers for answers? The question becomes even sharper when we consider that many contemporary scholars and researchers are studying ostensibly depth psychological or spiritual dimensions of reality: psychology, consciousness, religious experience, even the sacred traditions of indigenous peoples, all while still working from within the materialist assumptions of their academic and social formation. The subject matter may be subtle, but the habits of thought often remain governed by the same structures of legitimacy: what can be measured, defended, professionalized, and made acceptable within the reigning worldview. Of course, I recognize the limits and logical dangers of such a question. The West is not one thing. Western thought is not one thing. It has generated instruments of domination, extraction, disenchantment, and spiritual impoverishment, but it has also generated some of the most profound counter movements against those very forces. Still, I think the question is relevant because it invites recognition and humility. It asks those of us working within Western intellectual lineages to acknowledge how deeply the modern world has been shaped by a materialist, mechanistic, and instrumental ethos. One that has too often granted authority to matter, measurement, efficiency, and utility, while diminishing the reality of inner life, the veracity of subjective experience, and the necessity for a life of meaning. That ethos has organized institutions, trained perception, and determined which experiences are granted legitimacy and which are dismissed as fantasy, error, pathology, superstition, or regression. It has censored and erased whole orders of value that might have had a softer, wiser, and more wholesome effect on human society and its evolutionary imperatives. In this sense, one of the great wounds of our time is not only ecological or political, but epistemological. It concerns what we're allowed to know, what we're allowed to trust, and what forms of reality we're permitted to name. This is especially true when we speak of magic, part of the subject of Dr. Tarnas's talk today. Like many others, I find myself drawn to the idea of magic without pretending to have full comprehension of what it is. Like many others, I've personally experienced events I can only call magical, extraordinary, even supernatural events that were as real to me as my own hands and feet can be said to be real. And yet, we live in a world in which such experiences are routinely dismissed as errors of perception. Those of us who have felt the reality of magic, synchronicity, or symbolic participation in our lives are often left stranded between certainty and doubt, recognition and frustration. This cultural violence against the veracity of personal experience is, to my mind, one of the hallmarks of our darkened time. People with institutional power still determine what reality is and is not. And anyone whose experience falls outside the sanctioned norm is quickly labeled naive, pathological, irrational, suspect, or worse. But the psyche does not disappear because it is denied. The symbolic life does not cease to operate because it is excluded from polite discourse. The imaginal world does not become unreal because modern consciousness has lost the language with which to approach it. My own sense is that the ability to participate in and even perhaps wield the force of magic is a human birthright, one we are exercising every day without enough consciousness. Human beings are powerful creators. We're always making worlds through imagination, attention, desire, and belief. Yet, because our awareness can sometimes be undeveloped, we use our power to create external realities, and then we wring our hands in despair over why external reality is so dark and troublesome. Most of us rely upon others to tell us what truth is, what reality is, what counts, what matters, what may be trusted. The responsibility of awakened consciousness is heavy, so we hand it over to others and ask them to bear it on our behalf. In this series of online talks, we're exploring the boundaries of awakened consciousness, its dimensions, its demands, and its forms of self-expression. Many of us can feel that consciousness is a magical miracle, but we do not yet know how to inhabit that miracle with sufficient wisdom, discipline, and love. We're all seeking our way toward a sustainable and loving humanity. We struggle together through light and darkness, searching for a wisdom that can withstand the pressures of temptation and fear. Like you, I am a seeker after truth, beauty, and joy as the epistemological epicenters of human actualization. This is why tonight's lecture is especially important. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Becca Tarnas. She is assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her doctoral dissertation, The Back of Beyond, the Red Books of C.G. Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien, brought depth psychology, literary imagination, and archetypal inquiry into a richly original dialogue. Her work moves at the intersection of philosophy, literature, ecology, and consciousness studies, with a particular gift for illuminating the imaginal dimensions of human experience. She is an editor of Archi, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology, and the author of Journey to the Imaginal Realm, a reader's guide to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Her scholarship and public work reflect a sustained engagement with C.G. Jung, Tolkien, archetypal studies, and the ecological imagination. She is also currently researching and writing a biography of Stanislav Grof, one of the co-founders of transpersonal psychology. Becca, we're so honored to welcome you.
Thank you so much, Gallery. That was just such a warm, beautiful introduction, as well as a deeply thought-provoking opening. So thank you so much for creating this container, for creating this colloquium, bringing all these people together on a Sunday morning, afternoon, evening, night, depending where you are. It's an honor to be here. I will say that I so wish I could go to the colloquium in Ascona, Switzerland in December. I cannot because at that point I'll have a new 3-month-old. I'm about 7 months pregnant right now as I'm speaking to you. So it's one reason I haven't been giving as many talks lately. And so it's really wonderful to be able to come and join all of you. And I'm honestly, I'm amazed at this turnout who's come out today. And as I was looking through all the list of participants, I was like, oh, I know that person from this area of my life, whether it's graduate school or astrology or, some reaching very far back, family, friends. So it's lovely to see all of you here and many names I've never seen before. So if you are new here, it's lovely to meet you as well. And I thank you all for joining us today. So when I was asked to offer this presentation for the Kosmos Institute colloquium, on this theme of the transcendent and the immanent, I knew that I wanted to speak about a subject that links the two, that links the celestial with the terrestrial, the above with the below, the inner with the outer, linking the transcendent and the immanent. And so I proposed to talk on something that I have been exploring over the last few years, although I have to say that it really is an amateur exploration at best. And this topic is of astrological magic. Now, as Galere was saying, astrology and magic are taboo subjects in the academy for the most part, unless it's spoken of in a historical context, often in condescending terms, really seen as relics of a superstitious past. But Kosmos Institute is the kind of institution that really allows for greater experimentation and exploration of esoteric subjects. It's a place that's specializing in myths and archetypes, in spirituality, where you can take introductory courses here on archetypal astrology and other such subjects. So I'm going to proceed today with some ground level sympathy for the subject, or at least some open-minded and open-hearted curiosity. And I'm also going to say that this talk is really laying a foundation for talking about what we might call magic, rather than an in-depth discussion of magic itself. Perhaps you can decide by the end, but I feel it's more laying a foundation than going very deeply into that particular subject, because I have to be honest, it's one that's new to me, and it's one that I have been exploring, but I wouldn't call myself an expert in. Whereas what I'm using to explore that is uh, an overlapping set of fields where I do feel a greater level of, let's just say, intellectual comfort. So, to give you some context, I've been a practicing archetypal astrologer for the last about a decade and a half. And as a second generation astrologer, I was raised in a milieu of astrological and archetypal language, even though I didn't turn serious attention to the subject until early adulthood, when it became clear that this was my calling. This is one of the things I was meant to be doing in the world. And an understanding of archetypes and how they relate to planetary alignments has been essential to that practice. And then from a different angle, for my PhD research, I explored these numerous parallels I found between the Red Book of Carl Gustav Jung and the Red Book of Westmarch of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is the name that is given to the manuscript of The Lord of the Rings within the context of that story. And so through that research, I explored the terrain of imagination, of visionary experience, the mundus imaginalis, or the imaginal realm, the world of the imagination, and also the phenomenon of synchronicity. So now I teach on those subjects as a professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness graduate program at CIAS. So my sources were already pointing me towards another field of knowledge that I had completely overlooked or had dismissed as unreal and unbelievable. And like astrology, the moment really has to be right to encounter magic and take it seriously. And to realize that it isn't the dramatic wand waving and sudden conjurings of the popular imagination. And it often comes during a moment of crisis, as a kind of grace that allows one to see the world in a new way. So, the basic premise of astrological magic, from my still growing and evolving understanding, is based in the theory of correspondences that was prevalent in the medieval era. So, certain material substances correspond with different planets in the cosmos. And if one gathers together the many herbs and minerals and metals and jewels, and perhaps even animal products that correspond with a particular planetary meaning, one can then invoke the qualities of that planetary archetype into one's life. It's the idea behind it. So in alchemy, we can see the correspondence of particular metals to specific planets. So gold with the sun, silver with the moon, a quicksilver or Mercury with Mercury, a copper with Venus, iron with Mars, tin with Jupiter, and then lead with Saturn. Venus's dance with the Earth and the Sun, it takes 8 years to trace out a five-petaled star in the heavens when you view it from a geocentric perspective. And so we see this five-petaled shape corresponding to materials that are sacred to Venus, who is the archetypal principle. Venus is the archetypal principle of love and beauty. So, for example, the rose, which is so commonly a symbol of love, comes from the Rosaceae family, which is defined and identified by its five-petaled structure. And not only are roses part of this family, but strawberries, raspberries, these very sensual fruits that we often associate with romantic occasions, are part of the Rosaceae family as well. And then from the rose plant, we can go to rose quartz, that pink stone that's said to nourish the heart. The sweetness of honey reflects the sweetness of Venus's archetypal qualities. If you've ever seen Venus shimmering above the horizon after sunset, it's just sparkling like a diamond just bursting forth from the heavens. You can understand why this planet was associated with beauty, with attraction, with desire and love, and with the material form of the diamond, for that matter. It looks like a diamond in the sky. It's this gem that we often use to symbolize eternally enduring love. So you can start to see, if you lean into your intuitive imagination, you can start to see how these kinds of correspondences work. And every planet has numerous earthly correspondences from the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms. So with astrological magic, which can be understood as a spiritual practice, one gathers together the corresponding materia, these different parts of the earthly realm, at a specific moment that's chosen for its astrological favorability or its astrological potency. And so one selects for a chart that emphasizes whatever qualities one is hoping to cultivate more fully in one's life. So it's actually similar to the idea of the birth chart reflecting the life and character of an individual. But instead of the birth of a human being, it is the birth of a particular prayer or the birth of an intention or an invocation. So magic is an intentional aligning of all archetypal factors from the celestial and terrestrial planes. So it's a joining of the immanent and the transcendent, so that a full correspondence and orchestration of a particular archetypal quality can be evoked. Okay, but how does that make any sense? Because to approach magic in our contemporary era, we have to deconstruct the worldview that we're seeing through. We have to go back through time to see what the world looked like to those who developed and practiced magic in earlier eras. And then we have to see why our own modern era cannot recognize such magic and dismisses it as the work merely of fiction. What is fiction anyway? But that's a different topic. Um, so I can't just accept magic on its own terms. I have to understand it within the context of an evolution of consciousness that's unfolded in myriad ways around the globe since humanity first awakened as a conscious species. So today, I want to take you on a philosophical journey by traveling through a variety of different worldviews, moving through a few eras in history that saw the world differently than we do today, or differently than our parents and grandparents saw it. And I particularly want to contrast the medieval and modern paradigms. So looking to a time when the magic that we're speaking of here was prevalent, and then looking to an era when that magic was scrubbed from the world, was disavowed and disbelieved. So together we'll be exploring the idea of worldviews and how they shape our very perception and experience of the world around us. So we hear this term quite frequently, but what is a worldview? A worldview is a set of beliefs, theories, perceptions, literally how you perceive the world, understandings, and interpretations that we take for granted for the most part in our everyday lived experience. So, as an example of one of these theories or beliefs, what keeps our feet on the ground, or what keeps a dropping stone from falling up or sideways, we typically just take that for granted now as gravity. And we also may take for granted that we're all separate individuals, that we're defined by a certain degree by the boundaries of our skin, that we have individual interiority, that we have thoughts and emotions that are our own, that we experience inside ourselves exclusively. So that may be something we also take for granted. Our worldview is the immersive water in which we swim, which often makes it difficult to perceive. But that paradigm shapes our world. And studying your worldview will inherently, once you start to turn your focus towards it, it'll inherently begin to bring cracks in that facade, if not in the foundation as well. So just simply asking yourself the question, what qualities of the cosmos do I take for granted, and how might I be more conscious of them? Asking yourself that question can begin this life-changing process of transforming your worldview. So the tradition of astrological magic arises from a worldview, or it would be better to say from a complex history of evolving worldviews that is quite different from the modern reductionistic scientific paradigm. So the world looked quite different to an ancient Greek citizen than it did to a medieval Christian theologian. And both look starkly different from a modern scientific cosmologist. So, just to explore one shift from the ancient Greek to the medieval Christian, we can look at their different understandings of the divine. So, for an ancient Greek philosopher such as Plato, the idea of infinity indicated chaos. Infinity indicated chaos. So, therefore, to be perfect, the divine must be bounded and limited. But then, as Hellenic thought was exposed to Hebraic consciousness, to the mystery religions of Alexandria, Neoplatonism developed, and with it came a new conception of the divine as infinite. And this conception of the divine as infinite was inherited by Christian theologians who then saw God as an infinite being, gifting existence to creation by limiting his infinite potential into finite created beings, such as humans or plants or animals and so forth. So the infinite divinity limits itself to create beings, to create the world. So in some ways, we can see the same conception of infinity inherited by the modern cosmological worldview, which perceives the universe to be so vast that it may as well be infinite. So for some, that brings up internal feelings that's very much like the Greeks. Infinity is chaos, and the universe has emerged through random chance collisions. And then for others, that understanding of the cosmos as infinite can inspire feelings of great freedom, a recognition that we live in an open universe that's brimming with creative potential that we can participate in. We have different responses to that idea. So I want to contrast two distinct worldviews so you can recognize how one's paradigm really does shape the world we see and experience and inhabit. And so for those two examples, I am situating myself within what has been called the Western world. So this is, of course, a culturally porous world. It's been influenced by many different cultures. But I'm situating myself here because this is my own lineage and the history with which I'm most familiar. So let's enter into the world of a medieval European, living at the time when some of the great alchemical texts and magical grimoires, such as the Picatrix, were composed. And when this medieval person looks up at the sky, she or he sees not a void or empty space, as this would be impossible in nature, but a complex structure. So if it was daytime, she would see light radiating from a living sun, just as the blood in our body pulsates from a living heart. And if it was nighttime, the vastness of the sky would not be open space that's separating the stars by trillions upon trillions of miles. There would be nested crystalline spheres upholding each of the planetary bodies. And so, what's important to remember about a worldview is that for this medieval person, she would have seen these translucent planetary spheres, not literally in the sense that we see the hand that's held up before our eyes, but with an inner sight that knows inherently these spheres exist. It would be taken for granted. And furthermore, these celestial spheres are emanating a celestial music that some can hear and others can't. But again, it's taken for granted that they're emanating this music. And then there's a greater sphere that's surrounding these planetary spheres that contains the stars, that contains the constellations and the great zodiacal belt. So the world is contained within these spheres, and the earthly realm is at the heart of it. So below the sphere of the moon is the domain of the four elements. So fire, earth, air, and water. And then out of these four elements, the entire sublunary realm, sublunary means the realm below the moon, below the sphere of the moon, is created out of those four elements. It makes everything, including our own bodies. And the four humors of the bodies, you might have heard of these, are made up of the four elements. And then the balance of each of these makes up our temperament. So fire corresponds with yellow bile in our body. And if we have an excess of that, our temperament, kind of think of this as a medieval personality designation, is choleric. Earth corresponds with black bile in the body, which corresponds to the temperament of the melancholic. Air corresponds to the blood in the body, which corresponds to the temperament of the sanguine. And then water corresponds to phlegm in the body, which then corresponds to the temperament of the phlegmatic. And now some of us may have more of a balance between these two. Some might be very extremely oriented toward one or the other. But medicine was oriented around creating balance between these parts of the body, between these humors or temperaments, and therefore balancing these elements of which the world was made. So in this worldview, when we see a stone fall, what pulls it to the earth is not gravity, but rather an inherent attraction of earthly substance to earthly substance, something that is more like desire or longing, because each element longs to be in its right place. Earth and water want to pull downward. Fire and air want to rise upwards. And so throughout the earth, different substances belong to or are beholden to the different planets, which of course is the great wealth of knowledge that's needed to practice astrological magic. So it might be tempting for some of us to stay within this worldview, but let's now come into a different paradigm, not necessarily a completely contemporary worldview, especially for those who are here in this audience, but the paradigm of the mid 20th century modern individual. And so this is a world that has gone through the Copernican revolution. So recognizing not the earth as the center of the cosmos, but the sun as the center of the solar system. The heavens themselves are now terrestrial. So they're no longer these perfect crystalline spheres, but planetary bodies formed of mineral and gas that's whirling through this new medium of space. And while Isaac Newton, at the height of the scientific revolution, laid forth the mathematics of gravity and planetary motion, By the early 20th century, some of his own paradigm assumptions were also coming into question as new discoveries were brought forth through the theories of relativity and eventually quantum physics. But still, for the sake of illustrating a lived worldview, which most of us are still not living within the quantum universe. We're living within a blend of Newtonian classical physics and Einsteinian relativity for the most part. Einstein's own theories introduced the conception of an expanding universe. And this was an idea that so disturbed Einstein that he fudged his own calculations. He introduced a cosmological constant to try and keep the universe fixed. So the idea of an expanding universe was more than his belief system could handle, much in the same way that for the ancient Greeks, the idea of infinity indicated chaos. So the assumptions that we take for granted within our worldview, they matter greatly. And when a new theory is backed up by evidence and it enters our world, it really can shake us to the foundations. So just as the Copernican revolution turned the world upside down, it unchained the earth, as Nietzsche said, and it set it spinning through space. The relativity and quantum revolutions had a similar effect upon the scientists studying them, even leading to a few distraught individuals taking their own lives because of the inability to reconcile their worldviews. Now, one of the great assumptions of the early 20th century modern paradigm, an assumption that has been carried from the beginning of the scientific revolution, was that the world was a predictable chain of cause and effect and eventually would be understood down to the most minute detail. And while this belief began as a faith in God's creation, that the mind of God was understandable and therefore creation could be discerned, it eventually shifted away from God and instead became a kind of faith in materialism. So the great difference between the modern worldview and the medieval, and really between the modern and any other lived worldview, was the belief that the world was material, while only the human being was endowed with meaning and purpose and intelligence. And it's within the heart of this materialist worldview that a great anomaly began to creep in. And this is the experience of synchronicity. So I wish now to turn to a figure whose life and work has greatly fascinated me and is also very central to the teachings espoused here at Kosmos Institute, and that's the Swiss depth psychologist C.G. Jung. So Jung was raised within this modern Western materialist paradigm. And although his father was a Christian pastor, it was very clear to him that his father's faith was slipping away, that he was filled with spiritual doubt, and that Christianity didn't hold the mystical power it once did within the Western world. So Jung was of a scientific mind, studying medicine and psychiatry, and eventually moving into the world of psychology, the study of the psyche. And as Jung established himself in the professional world, he eventually reached a crisis point. He was being overwhelmed by visions and by fully encompassing fantasies, and he was starting to doubt his sanity. He thought that he had unleashed a latent psychosis, a state that was similar to what he'd witnessed amongst his schizophrenic patients. And what he came to realize was that over the course of his time establishing himself in the professional world of modern medicine and science, he'd lost connection with his soul. And so this is how it came to be that one November night in 1913, he found himself calling out, my soul, where are you?" And it took multiple nights of such calling, of writing down his experiences, of trying to make contact with an inner world that he'd lost. But eventually she answered. The soul answered. And when she did, she was furious. And when the soul finally spoke to Jung, these are the words she said. She said, "Do you know then who I am? Have you grasped me, defined me, and made me into a dead formula? Have you measured the depths of my chasms and explored all the ways down which I am yet going to lead you? This scientific reductionist approach to psychology, which literally translates as the language of the psyche, had been trying to reduce soul to a dead system. And indeed, Jung's loss of his soul spoke to a much larger problem within the disenchanted modern paradigm. The West had lost its soul and needed to embark on the descent to recover it, to recover that meaningful relationship. So Jung's personal journey in relation to soul, he recorded in the great book that came to be called Liber Novus. It's better known as the Red Book. And these profound visionary imaginal experiences that Jung underwent became the primary foundations of his analytical psychology, what we now call Jungian psychology. And this led to his development of such concepts as the psychological types, the individuation process, psychological archetypes, including the archetype of the self, and an understanding of the collective unconscious as the mythic ground of all human experience. Now, one key theory that first emerged during Jung's Red Book period later on became a central concern of his thought. And this is a phenomenon that Jung began to notice in his practice, both in his own lived experience and also amongst his patients. And Jung came to call this phenomenon synchronicity. So, a synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence between one's internal state of consciousness, such as our thoughts, our emotions, perhaps a dream or internal image, and an outer event that symbolically reflects the interior state. And what is important is that there's no causal connection between the inner and outer events. They just happen to occur within the same period of time. And they're usually experiences that take us by surprise. They catch our attention, and there's this feeling of wonder and awe and numinosity that's present. So Jung gives a significant example of a synchronicity in his essay on the subject that illustrates this phenomenon very well. And I imagine many of you have heard or read this story before, but I think it's worth recounting here as a paradigmatic example. Jung had a patient who was rigidly rational. She was trapped in her Cartesian education, and any progress they were making in her psychological treatment, it was continuously blocked by her ability to just rationally explain away anything meaningful. And so Jung concluded that something truly irrational would have to intervene, that it was beyond his ability to shift her perspective. And so one day she was telling him about a dream that she'd had the night before, in which she was being given a costly piece of jewelry that was shaped as a golden scarab. And as she was speaking, Jung heard a tapping on the window of his office. And so he was distracted and he went to the window, and to his great surprise, he saw a beautiful beetle who was tapping at the window as though it was trying to get into the room. So this insect was a rose chafer beetle, which is the closest relative to a scarab that lives in those northern latitudes of Switzerland. So he quietly opens the window and he gently carries the beetle inside in his hand. And as his patient was finishing recounting her dream, Jung opened his hand with the words, "Here is your scarab." And the impact of that unexpected coincidence of a scarab-like beetle coming into the room right as Jung's patient was describing her dream, it so shocked the woman that it cracked the rational foundations of her worldview, and it allowed a deeper sense of meaning and soulful connection to break into her life. And so from this pivotal moment forward, as Jung describes, they were able to proceed successfully with her psychological treatment. So the world itself seemingly orchestrated this woman's reconnection with soul, with the soul of the world, with the anima mundi. And Jung collected numerous instances of such meaningful coincidences. And he coined this name for them, synchronicity. It's a really beautiful word. It's one we often hear today, although sometimes I notice it can be misapplied. The etymological roots of the word synchronicity are Greek. They come from sun, meaning together, and chronos, meaning time. So synchronicity means a coming together in time. And Jung differentiated synchronicity from synchronous, which synchronous indicates two events occurring at once that may or may not be related. But synchronicity, it involves two factors. One is an unconscious image that surfaces into consciousness, such as a dream, an idea, or a feeling premonition. And then two, an external event that occurs simultaneously or relatively simultaneously with no causal connection that carries the same meaning. So, what really defines a synchronicity versus a mere coincidence is its relationship to meaning. And so, a synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence between an inner and outer event in which the subjective state, so our inner experience, is reflected in the outer event without there being any direct causal connection between the two. And what the inner and outer event share in common is an archetypal core. The symbolism between the two is the same. And to narrow this definition even further, the meaning inherent to a synchronicity plays a significant role in an individual's healing and their movement towards psycho-spiritual wholeness. So the experience of the synchronicity carries a feeling of numinosity, and it can bring about spiritual awakening, an awakening to an interconnected reality that unifies the psyche with the cosmos. And I imagine that each of you have had certain experiences of synchronicity in your life. And maybe as I'm describing this, you can recall some of your own personal examples. I find that the more attuned you are to the synchronization of events and their symbolic nature, the more the universe seems to want to show these experiences to you. So we need to develop something like a naturalist's keen perception of the environment, viewing the natural world as a ground for symbolic expression. Now, synchronicities do also have a shadow side. When we're not sufficiently psychologically aware, paying close attention to synchronicities can lead one to a kind of self-referential aggrandizement. So we need to develop balanced discernment to cultivate a humble attunement to the larger whole beyond our individual selves. And I found that just like periods when we struggle to remember our dreams, sometimes we can go through long periods in life that are like synchronicity dry spells. And then at other times, it can feel like the synchronicities are just popping up everywhere, like mushrooms surfacing from the network of mycelia after a warm rain. And that's a good image because synchronicities are like these fruiting bodies of fungi because they're not isolated. They indicate this vast and interconnected network that's hidden below the ground. So the mushrooms are just simply the temporary indication of that extensive mycelial network, just like the synchronicity experience is the temporary indication of the interconnected, archetypally patterned order of reality. Now, synchronicities often have a very personal nature to them, although I do think we can understand the phenomenon of synchronicity in some collective cases. For example, my own research into the numerous parallels between Jung's Red Book and J.R.R. Tolkien's Red Book of Westmarch, I think is one such collective case. I won't go into that now, but because of their often intimate and personal nature, we we often want to guard the experience of a synchronicity as we would a precious jewel, keeping it hidden and sharing it only in the most sympathetic settings. Um, Often the numinosity of a synchronicity, it can be soured or even lost by sharing it at the wrong time or with the wrong person. And some synchronicities just involve too many complex personal details and chains of events to make a good public story, even if that event was absolutely life-changing for the individual. So Jung began using the term synchronicity in the late 1920s, and he didn't actually publish on the subject until the early 1950s. He accumulated a great deal of evidence from his clinical practice and his personal life, which formulated the anecdotal foundation of the theoretical principle. He had conversations with Albert Einstein, with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, that really helped shape his understanding of the principle within the context of modern physics. And Jung saw the synchronicity principle as a challenge to the conception of the world that was depicted by the modern scientific paradigm, the paradigm of classical physics, which is dependent on the notion of direct causality. So this notion of causality is the belief that every effect must have a cause, even if that cause is not apparent to scientific observation yet. So from this perspective, there is the belief that with enough scientific inquiry, that causal relationship can be found. In Jung's monograph, which he called Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, he gives this key example of a synchronicity, the story I just shared of the woman with the golden scarab. And it is a paradigmatic case, not just as a simple example of a synchronicity, but really in some ways we can see it as the archetypal pattern of synchronicity itself. It has all the key qualities of a synchronicity. So there's the synchronization in time between the woman describing her dream and the arrival of the scarab beetle at the window. There's the lack of a direct causal connection between the dream and the beetle. And then there's even just the improbability of the beetle tapping against the window and drawing Jung's attention, that he actually heard it. And then there's the psycho-spiritual breakthrough for the woman with the recognition of the synchronicity. And then finally, this overall sense of numinosity that's inherent to the scene. And so what connects the acausal events of a synchronicity is the archetypal meaning coming through each event. And in the case of the scarab beetle synchronicity, Jung identified the archetype running through the acausally connected events as rebirth. Rebirth was the symbolic archetypal core or theme of the synchronicity. And the scarab is a symbol of rebirth that's coming from Egyptian cosmology. It's related to the daily journey of the sun dying into the west, traversing the underworld realms below the earth, and then being reborn anew at dawn in the east. So the experience for Jung's patient led to a rebirth of her worldview, just as her former Cartesian rationalism it underwent a deconstruction, a kind of setting, descent, and then a new, more holistic perspective of the world was born or dawned. Now, part of the key of the synchronicity principle is the recognition that the specific events themselves could be different, so long as the archetypal core remains the same. It's the archetype itself is the essential element of a synchronicity. The symbolism of rebirth that is in the informing that is the informing archetype of that synchronicity, I think it indicates not just a psychological rebirth for Jung's patients, but also a rebirth for the modern worldview in which the severed connection between the interiority of the psyche and the exteriority of the world are linked and reforged once more. So it is a moment reconnecting the immanent with the transcendent as well. Now, another key element of the scarab beetle synchronicity is Jung's own participation in the event. So as the woman was speaking, Jung heard the tapping of the beetle on the window. And he could have ignored it, or he could have not even heard it. But he did. He picked up on it and he quietly stood up. He opened the window. He retrieved the beetle. And then his statement to his patient, here is your scarab, that's what makes the synchronistic event complete. So without his essential role, the breakthrough for the woman would not have occurred. And because of Jung's particular life experiences, he was an individual who was unusually attuned to the patterns of the natural world. He was always making note of significant or unusual occurrences. So if he heard the lake lapping louder outside his office window, or if he saw several birds fly across the horizon during a session, he would note whether these natural events had any symbolic significance to the material at hand. So Jung had this epistemological openness to the idea that meaningful coincidences can carry genuine knowledge and significance. And he was able to view the world through a symbolic lens that allowed him to perceive the archetypal principle connecting the inner and outer events of a synchronicity. So Jung had a highly developed and subtly attuned archetypal eye, as James Hillman calls it. So because I am speaking about the archetypal core of meaning that is inherent to a true synchronicity, I feel that a few words on archetypes themselves might be appropriate at this moment. So the word archetype is one that's frequently used in both depth psychology and astrology, um, although the exact meaning may be somewhat elusive. And this is for good reason, since our understanding of archetypes, or what the term archetype refers to, has shifted over the millennia. Um, so the philosophical theory of archetypes really emerged with Plato in ancient Greece. And the word he used for them was ideas or forms, like idea with a capital I or form with a capital F. The Platonic forms are universal principles that inform and give shape to the world around us. So, for example, every tree in the world, the great variety and diversity of trees, every species and every individual tree within each species, they all participate in the archetypal principle or the Platonic idea of tree, tree with a capital T or treeness. Now, an example that Plato often likes to give is the idea of horse or horseness, the capital H. Every particular and individual horse participates in the form of horse. And a more abstract example, one that was one of the highest principles that Plato aspired to, is that of beauty, beauty with a capital B. And I think that this one really illustrates well what we mean by an archetypal principle, because whether we're looking at a beautiful flower like a blooming rose, or a sparkling gem, or a gorgeous, lush landscape. Maybe you're watching an exquisite sunset. Maybe you're gazing into the face of your beloved. These are all very different particular manifestations. They're not the same physically by any means, but they're all beautiful to the degree that they participate in the archetypal form of beauty. So our word archetype comes from the Greek word archai, which means first principle. And Plato understood these archai to be dwelling in a transcendent realm beyond our earthly plane. But the two realms participate in each other by means of a middle realm called the metaxy. And daemons traverse this middle realm, communicating between the heavenly and earthly domains. Now, Plato's student Aristotle conceived of a different means of understanding of how such universals relate to particulars. So Aristotle saw the universals as immanent rather than transcendent. And he thought that the human mind then goes on to abstract these categories from the particulars that we see in everyday life. And then we recognize them to be universal categories. So rather than there being an archetypal Platonic tree with a capital T again, this perfect archetypal tree that's dwelling in a transcendent domain, Aristotle thought the form of tree was in each individual tree. And then we go on to abstract the form of tree from the many trees we perceive. And then we create a categorical universal. Now, this great difference between Plato and Aristotle's understanding of archetypes can be seen in this image. This is the School of Athens, painted by the Renaissance master Raphael. This is in the Vatican. And you can see right there at the center a depiction of Plato and Aristotle. And we go a little bit closer to these two. We can see that the older figure of Plato is pointing upwards. He's pointing towards this transcendent realm, whereas the younger figure of Aristotle is pointing outwards towards the immanent realm. Are the archetypes transcendent, something that is divine and perfect, but the world participates in, or is it embedded in the world itself? So that's at the center of this extraordinary image. And, the distinction between these two philosophies of archetypes, in some ways, it has less to do with these two individual Greek men, although the way they articulated it is very valuable for understanding of the distinction. At some point, we can almost think of Plato and Aristotle like mythic figures of the philosophical imagination, than actual living people of they were both, but the way we've inherited their ideas, they become so much bigger than that. And it has more to do with how these transcendent and immanent perspectives went on to shape different philosophical and religious streams in the millennia that followed. So the debate between the two worldviews, it was carried in every direction. It was carried south and east and north and west at different times in history. And we can trace their threads and their mutual influences in many various cultures and traditions. But ultimately, at the core, it's this philosophical question of how do universals relate to particulars? And then the further question of whether these universal principles are categories of the human mind or are of the world beyond the human, whether in a transcendent or immanent form, or maybe both. So by the modern era, such universals were dominantly seen as interior categories of the human mind. This is evidenced in Immanuel Kant's a priori categories. And this was the perspective that Jung inherited, although more and more of his experiences of synchronicity began to break down this fixed interiority. So Jung's visionary encounter with the collective unconscious, it brought him face to face with these archetypal principles. But in his experience, they came as particular imaginal figures, figures that could almost be described like daemons. And out of these experiences, in conjunction with the material he drew from the records of his patients, Jung formulated the idea of psychological archetypes. And now some of these bear the names of personified figures, such as the Great Mother, or the Shadow, or the Anima, or the Hero, the Divine Child, the Wise Old Man. These are probably familiar to many of you. But he also saw particular geometrical shapes as archetypal principles, shapes such as the mandala, or the quaternity, or the cross, and the spiral. And whole numbers, Jung recognized, might be the most fundamental archetypal principles of all, creating the very foundation of reality. And I think it's interesting that Jung's recognition of number as the foundation of archetypes, it echoes 2,500 years earlier, Plato's decree that anyone who would enter the Platonic Academy must have an understanding of geometry. Now, this will be familiar to any astrologer who relies on a symbolic understanding of number to read astrological aspects, which are the geometrical angles formed between the planetary bodies. So ultimately, although Jung was committed for most of his career to the Kantian perspective that archetypes were interior categories and therefore they had no bearing on the external world, this growing body of evidence of synchronicities began to erode this barrier between inner and outer. And Jung had to start recognizing that archetypes are not only psychological principles, they are universal principles of the cosmos itself. And so he came to recognize that archetypes are dipolar. They are psychological and material. They're spiritual and instinctual. And Jung created a term, or drew on another's term for this quality of archetypes that's both psychological and material. And the term is psychoid. And it was from the psychoid domain that synchronicities emerged. So Jung's proposal of archetypes as psychoid suggests that it's the archetypes themselves that create the mysterious link between psyche and matter. That archetypes can manifest psychically and physically, and they can do so simultaneously, as we see with synchronicity. And Jung saw synchronicities as evidence of the unus mundus, the one world spoken of by the alchemists. So often by definition, synchronicities are considered to be rare and usually personal events, but there is one extensive field of evidence that indicates synchronicities are in fact not rare at all, and that, of course, is astrology. So synchronicity has been one of the concepts by which some contemporary astrologers, argued most articulately by Richard Tarnas, how we can understand how astrology works, especially when expanding out of the context of the modern worldview. So this perspective indicates that the planets and their positions, they're not physically causing the events that unfold on Earth, but they're rather correlating with those events. And the planetary bodies can be understood like the hands on a clock. So if the clock is indicating that it's 12 p.m., the clock is not causing it to be noon, it simply correlates with that time. And one can understand the movement of the planets in the same way. Their positions indicate the quality of time in human experience, and their movements trace these ever-changing dynamics in individual human lives and in the larger patterns of collective experience in history. So astrology can be seen as this continuously ongoing, universally visible form of synchronicity. So this meaningful coincidence between an outer event, in this case, the positions of the planets, and an inner event, so the unfolding of human experience on Earth. And furthermore, bringing a study of transit astrology into relationship with tracking personal synchronicities, it actually gives one a deeper understanding of the archetypal principles that are involved in the synchronicity. So we can then better understand the meaning of a synchronicity when it happens to us by looking at the transits at that particular moment in time. We can see who is present there. So synchronicity restores a concept that has been missing in the modern worldview, and that is the notion of complex causality. So if we look again to ancient Greece and we return to the philosophy of Aristotle, we'll learn that Aristotle proposed four different forms of causality. And these four forms are material cause, efficient cause, formal cause, and final cause. So material cause is simply the matter or material of which a physical substance is made. And efficient cause is the antecedent or the prior condition that brought the substance about. So it can be helpful to use the image, kind of classic image of a billiard ball to illustrate this. So the material cause is the physical matter of the billiard ball. The efficient cause is the cue ball hitting the billiard ball, which in turn was efficiently caused to move by the cue stick, which was in turn moved by the hand holding it, and so forth. That motion, that chain of cause and effect, that's the efficient cause, but it's physical. And so material and efficient causality are the only two forms of causality that are accounted for in classical physics. So this is the physics of Newton that was dominant really up until the quantum revolution. Um, but Aristotle proposed two more forms of causality, which are directly relevant to our understanding of synchronicity. So formal cause is the defining characteristics of a substance. It's the form or the shape of something. It's the shape of a tree or a butterfly. It's the spiral of a whirlpool or the Fibonacci sequence in a nautilus shell. It's the shape of a human being. Think back to Aristotle's understanding of the form of tree that's immanent to the tree. That's the formal cause of the tree, being a tree. In light of depth psychology, an archetype provides the formal cause to a psychological complex or to a synchronistic event. And then the last type of causality that Aristotle described is the final cause. And the final cause is the purpose of something. It's the teleology of the being. So to understand why something exists, according to Aristotle, we have to look not to its beginning, but to its end. So the final cause of the acorn is the oak tree. The final cause of the embryo is the adult animal or human being. And the final cause of the soul from a depth psychological perspective can be individuation. So the archetype of the self is the final cause that directs the individuation process. And synchronicities can be a guide along the stages of that process, indications of the final cause or telos of our soul. So this principle of synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, as Jung called it, it actually restores these ancient forms of causality, the formal and final cause, to our conception of the world. So keeping in mind the multivalent nature of archetypes, I would suggest that the archetype does have a causal role to play in the synchronicity, but it's not the kind of efficient or material causality that's recognized by modern science. This is why Jung calls synchronicity acausal, because it's not efficiently or materially caused. But the archetype gives the events their form and also their equivalence in meaning. So the archetype can be seen as the formal cause in the Aristotelian sense of the synchronicity. So there is a cause there, but differently than modern Newtonian physics could understand. And then the role of time in a synchronicity is another key element, as is apparent from the very name, synchronos, a falling together in time. And a synchronicity points towards the archetypal quality of that moment in time. Now, how long a moment lasts depends in part on the archetype being constellated in that moment. So while a synchronicity can be exactly simultaneous, there can also be a lapse of some hours or days or even months, depending on the kind of event. And from a Jungian perspective, synchronicities, they can't be predicted and they can't be replicated, which is part of why they pose such a challenge to the scientific method. Um, but they can be understood probabilistically. So a synchronicity may occur if an archetype is constellated. And if it does occur, then we can infer it will carry the same meaning as the archetype. But how do we discover if an archetype will be constellated? And again, this is where the role of astrology comes in and why I've taken us on this very long journey through worldviews and archetypes and synchronicity. So although I've given here philosophical and psychological definitions of archetypes, there is a much older word that can encompass the many meanings of the word archetype, and this is gods. So, what Plato was trying to articulate in philosophical language, what Jung was articulating in psychological language, was an understanding of the great gods and deities of the ancient mythic worldview. So, the universal archetypes are present in different guises in the various pantheons of the world: the Greek and Roman, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Vedic, the Norse, the Celtic, the Mayan, the Yoruba, and so forth. So when I speak of the eternal forms and the archai, the universals and the archetypes, I'm also always speaking about the gods. And these gods come forth in different manifestations, depending on the cultural conditions and the individuals who are enacting them through a participatory relationship. So the practice of astrological magic relies on astrological timing techniques that allow one to know when a particular archetype or a combination of archetypes will be constellated. And it's the practice of predicting when a synchronicity will occur and then aligning oneself along with the appropriate archetypally relevant materials with that qualitative moment in time. So it is defying what the modern perspective believes, that synchronicities are unpredictable and anomalous. And when we align ourselves with the archetypal threads of synchronicity, that is when literal magic happens. And the inner and outer worlds align, and the archetypal core of meaning, the presence of the God, radiates through every dimension in that moment of time, through you, through the materia, and through the world around you. So I want to end here and open up into dialogue so that from this foundation in synchronicity and archetypes, we can explore this question of magic together and see what insights can arise between us collectively. So thank you all so much for listening, for the gift of your attention and presence. I really appreciate it.